Okay, so we have the basics of working with a gradient down here, and our rotten tomato guy, he's looking pretty good here. Obviously, we want to do a lot more to him. So I'm going to move up and select his leafy green part here. Now, if you want, you can either click on the object like I've done here, or you can use your layers palette, which you saw earlier. And I want to fill this obviously with a greenish type gradient. And I always find it easiest to start with a basic gradient and then build on it from there. Now I can do a number of different things to fill this object with a gradient. As you saw just a few minutes ago, I could start with my white to black gradient inside my swatches palette, or any of the others actually. I could use any of these gradients that Illustrator gives me. Or down in the bottom of my toolbox, Illustrator remembers the last gradient that I had used, which is that custom gradient that we just created for our tomato fill. So I could use that if I like. Or over in my gradient palette, you can see that the gradient palette is remembering the last gradient that was used as well. So I'm going to start with that. I'm just going to single click on the thumbnail there. That fills the leafy green top with the same gradient that we had just used, but obviously we need to tweak it quite a bit here. We want to use some greens in here rather than reds. Now, you've already seen that I can click on a color stop inside my gradient palette and then go and play with that color inside my color palette. Can certainly do that, but I'm going to move my color palette over to the right side here, because what I'd like to do is I'd like to add in some swatches from the swatches palette. Now what I can do is find a green that I'd like to use in my gradient palette and simply click and drag it down onto my gradient slider down at the bottom here, and you can see that that adds in the green on my gradient. Take a look back on my leafy green top and you can see it in there. Now obviously I don't want any red in here, so I'm going to take this scarlet here that I had started with, and to get rid of it, to remove it from the gradient, I'm just going to click and drag it straight off the bottom of the palette. And then I can move my green stop over to where I need it. So yeah, literally just drag the color stops off the bottom of the gradient palette if you don't want them in your gradient anymore. We'll do the same here over on the right side of the gradient. I don't want this dark red happening here, so I'm going to go and find instead a dark green. And I'll go and drag that green from my swatches palette down onto the gradient slider. I'll take my red gradient here on the right and literally just drag it straight off the bottom of my palette, readjust the dark green stop there, and take a look at your artwork. It's looking pretty good. Okay, what else can we do with gradients? Well, let's take a look at the different types of gradients that we can work with. We've been working with what's known as a linear gradient. So that's a gradient that transitions from one color to another color. I can come in here and set a different angle if I choose. I could come in and type in 15 degrees, for example, and hit enter on my keyboard, and that slants my gradient ever so much here. I'll try something a little bit more dramatic. I'll try 90. And there we are. Now you can see it starting with the dark at the top and ending with the light at the bottom here. So it starts from the right and moves over to the left on my gradient slider here. Or you can type in whatever value you'd like. So there's setting the angle of your gradient. We can also switch to what's known as a radial gradient. And what a radial gradient is a gradient that starts in the center and moves outward. You can see on the little gradient thumbnail here, or more prominently back on your artwork back in Illustrator. So you can see that the light green, which is on the left side of the gradient slider, starts in the middle, and then it moves all the way out to the dark green over on the edges of my leafy bits on the top here. Of course, like you've seen so far, I can always move my color stops here to adjust my gradient. And you can see here that I actually have an extra green stop here. I must have duplicated that by accident. And I'm going to show you how to duplicate your color stops shortly. If you've done the same thing here, we've already seen how to remove your color stops. Just drag them straight off the bottom of your little gradient slider there. So you can adjust your gradient. The idea here is to adjust it to your taste. Get it so that things are looking good. There, I'm pretty pleased with that. So there's my leafy green top there. I've used a radial gradient on it. Now, I'm looking back at the rest of my tomato here. I still have a ways to go. I'm going to have to do something about this drooly stuff here, which is kind of disgusting. And I'm going to have to do something about his eye here as well as his teeth. Let's take a look at the eye here. What I'm going to do with his eye is I'm going to use a radial gradient here that usually works fairly well for circular objects or eyes and so on. And I want to make this guy look pretty mean here. So I'm thinking of a gradient maybe that starts in a yellow and maybe fades out to a red of some sort here, or maybe a white to a yellow or something like this. The cool thing with working with Illustrator's gradients is you can always adjust them and manipulate them as you go. So let's get started on this eye here. And you've already seen how to work with some gradients already, so if you want to start with something in the swatches palette, that's fine. I'm going to start with my green gradient here. There he is. Let's take a quick look at how that looks. Yeah, not bad. He looks pretty angry. So let's adjust this a little bit. So I'm going to try going from the yellow to maybe a dark red here. So you've seen how to do this a number of times already. I'll go and find a red swatch on my swatches palette and drag it down onto my gradient slider here. Pull off the green stop there. How's that looking? He looks pretty upset there. All right, let's keep tweaking it here. I'll grab this guy here. I want to switch that to some kind of a yellow maybe. Something like this. Maybe adjust my slider just a little bit. See how I'm doing that? I'm just moving my stop there. He looks quite upset there. Now I think what I'll do though is, this looks pretty good, but I don't like the red around the edges. And this is usually the way things go in Illustrator. You have an idea in your head and you go for it and you realize that things aren't really looking the way you want them to look. So that's okay. We can always change things. So I'm going to take my eyeball here, and rather than going to red, I'm going to switch this to white. So I'm just going to grab my white swatch on my swatches palette, pull that down, and now I have something like this happening. There we go. He looks pretty upset there. There we go. That looks pretty good. Okay, how about his teeth here? We got to do something about his teeth. He looks obviously like he's been around for a while here. He's got some hair and mold and things like this growing on him. So we'd want to make his teeth look equally as disgusting and decrepit and old. Now, each of his teeth here, you can see they're individual objects here. So what I'll have to do is select each of them individually here. I'm just holding down Shift on my keyboard. I'm grabbing each of these teeth here. There's a little tiny sliver right there. And grab my black background there. I just held down Shift to deselect it. So if you accidentally select an object as you're going along, just hold down Shift and click on it again, and that will deselect it. I'll grab the remaining white pieces here all the way along. His teeth look way too sparkly here, like he just came from the dentist, so we want to make this look a little bit more decrepit here. So I might start with a yellow here of some sort. That looks pretty good, actually. That looks pretty neat. But I'm going to switch this back to a linear gradient. There we are. And I might do something like this. Put it on an angle here. There we go. That's looking pretty grotesque here. But now I want to take an opportunity here to show you something else. So my gradient here, it's a linear gradient. It's on a 90-degree angle. It's going from this yellow over to white, looking pretty good. But what I'd like to do here is add in an additional color to my gradient. So far you've only seen gradients that have used two colors. I want to add in a third color. And to do that, I can just single click anywhere along my gradient slider here, and that adds in a new color stop. In fact, what happens is, depending on where I click on this gradient slider, Illustrator is going to duplicate that color down into my little color stop here. So there's the stop there. And you've already seen that you can move your color stops around a little bit, but did you know you can do this? I'm going to take my white stop and drag it past my new yellow stop, and now I get this kind of an effect happening. So now his teeth are nice and white in the middle, and yellow and gross and disgusting on the outsides there. So something like that. So that looks pretty cool. So again, if you want to add in additional colors, just single click anywhere along your gradients. You can have as many colors inside your gradients as you need. And don't forget to get rid of your color stops. Just drag them off the bottom, just like that.